Admiral Kang Miho felt her hands shake as she stared at the giant screen on her ship's bridge. The hologram showed something that made her stomach twist with fear and anger. Dozens of strange alien creatures filled a massive chamber that looked like it could hold 1,000,000 beings. These weren't friendly visitors coming to say hello. These were the rulers of the galaxy, and they had bad news for Earth. The alien speaking looked like a walking crystal tower, taller than 3 humans stacked on top of each other. Its name was Velthar, and when it spoke, its voice boomed across space like thunder. This creature represented the Vorthak, one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. For thousands of years, other aliens had trembled when they heard that voice. "Listen carefully, humans," Velthar said, and every word felt like ice in Miho's veins. "Your species will give us 70% of everything you have. Your metals, your food, your technology, and your people. You have 1 year to deliver this tribute to us." Captain Lee Jiho stood next to Miho, his face pale as paper. He was supposed to be Earth's best negotiator, the man who could talk his way out of any problem. But how do you negotiate with beings who treat entire worlds like their personal property? "If you refuse," Velthar continued, "we will send our enforcement fleets to correct your mistake." The worst part wasn't the threat. It was watching what happened next. One by one, representatives from other alien species nodded their heads like robots. Some looked like giant insects, others resembled walking plants, and a few seemed to be made of pure energy. But they all did the same thing. They agreed without question. Miho realized she was watching slaves pretend to be diplomats. These weren't free beings making choices. They were conquered peoples who had learned to smile while their masters spoke. Captain Lee whispered to her, "How many worlds do you think they control?" "Thousands," Miho whispered back, watching a bird-like alien nod eagerly at Velthar's words. "Maybe tens of thousands." The crystal alien continued speaking as if discussing the weather. "This process has worked successfully for 50,000 years. Every species eventually understands that cooperation brings peace, while resistance brings only pain." Miho watched a small furry creature that reminded her of Earth's rabbits. It was nodding so hard its ears flopped back and forth. She wondered if that species had once been proud warriors before the Council broke their spirit. "How your technology appears primitive," Velthar said, almost sounding bored. "Your weapons are simple, your ships are slow. Integration should be straightforward." But something burned in Miho's chest as she listened. These aliens talked about humans, like they were already defeated, like Earth was just another rock to be added to their collection. They spoke about taking 70% of Earth's people as if they were discussing cattle. Captain Lee clenched his fists. Around the bridge, other human officers stared at the screen with growing anger. Nobody spoke, but Miho could feel their rage building like pressure in a volcano. The transmission ended with Velthar's final words echoing in the silence. "We await your submission within 1 solar cycle." The screen went dark, leaving the bridge in shadows. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Miho turned to her crew and saw something in their eyes that probably scared the aliens more than any weapon. She saw humans who had just been told they weren't free anymore, and humans didn't like being told what to do. The emergency alarm screamed through every government building on Earth. Within hours of the alien transmission, world leaders were scrambling into crisis meetings that would determine humanity's fate. The air in these rooms felt thick with fear and desperation. In Seoul, President Park So-min's face was red with anger as she paced around the meeting table like a caged tiger. Her advisors had never seen her this furious. "They want to take 70% of our children, our parents, our brothers and sisters, to work as slaves," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "How is this even a discussion?" Her defense minister tried to speak calmly, but his hands were shaking. "Madam President, their technology is thousands of years ahead of ours. They have weapons that could turn our cities to dust in seconds." Similar scenes played out across the planet. In Washington, the president stared at satellite images showing the alien fleet's massive size. In London, the Prime Minister held his head in his hands as intelligence reports poured in about species that had tried to resist and failed. In Beijing and Moscow, military generals argued about weapons that seemed like toys compared to what the aliens possessed. Some leaders wanted to surrender immediately. General Kim Tae-won from the Korean military spoke for many when he said, "We've seen what happens to planets that resist. They become lifeless rocks floating in space. At least, if we give them what they want, some of us will survive. But others refuse to accept defeat." The French president pounded her desk and declared, "We didn't survive 2 world wars just to hand our children over to alien slave masters." The Japanese prime minister quietly added, "Our ancestors would rather die fighting than live on their knees." For 3 days and nights the arguments raged. Video calls connected every capital as humanity's leaders debated their species' future. Some meetings ended with people screaming at each other. Others ended in tears. The weight of choosing between slavery and extinction crushed down on everyone. Then Admiral Kang Mi-ho requested to speak to all the world leaders at once. When her face appeared on screens around the globe, she looked tired but determined. Her uniform was wrinkled from days without sleep, but her eyes burned with something that made everyone listen. "I've been thinking about this wrong," she said quietly. "We're debating like politicians when we should be thinking like humans. These aliens expect us to beg, to negotiate, to find some middle ground where we only lose half our freedom instead of all of it." The room fell silent. Even the translation software seemed to pause. "But what if we don't play their game at all?" Mi-ho continued. "What if we send them a response they've never heard before in 50,000 years of conquest?" President Park leaned forward. "What kind of response?" Mi-ho's lips formed the smallest smile. "One word. Just one simple word that every human understands, in every language we speak." The debate that followed was intense but brief. Some called it suicide. Others called it the most human thing they could do. But as the hours passed, something strange happened. One by one, every leader began to nod, not because they were conquered, like those alien representatives, but because they were choosing to stand together. When the final vote was counted, it was unanimous. Humanity would send its response on all frequencies, broadcasted across the galaxy so clearly that every alien species would hear it. The message was ready. Now they just had to wait and see if one word could change everything. The transmission went out across the galaxy at exactly noon, Earth time. Every radio telescope, every satellite, every communication device humanity possessed broadcast the same message. It traveled through space at the speed of light, carrying 2 simple letters that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. No, that was it. No explanation, no conditions, no diplomatic language. Just one word that every human child learns before they can walk properly. The same word that had been spoken by countless humans throughout history when faced with bullies, tyrants, and those who demanded submission. In the Grand Council chamber, the response hit like a physical blow. Elder Korthvak, an ancient being that looked like a massive tree made of silver metal, had been alive for over 8,000 years. He had personally overseen the conquest of 10,000 worlds. He had heard every possible response to the Council's ultimatums, begging, bargaining, desperate offers of alternative tributes, and finally, inevitable surrender. But never this. The elder's voice creaked like old wood as he spoke to the chamber. What did they say?" His translator was struggling, as if the simple word broke something in its programming. War Coordinator Zeftal, a creature that resembled a giant spider made of black steel, immediately began typing commands into his control panel. His mechanical limbs moved frantically as he accessed military databases. "This cannot be correct," he muttered. "The translation systems must be malfunctioning," but the word kept coming. Every frequency, every channel broadcast the same simple message. No. The human voices saying it were calm, clear, and absolutely certain. Ambassador Yindar, from the peaceful collective, whispered in shock. Her species looked like floating jellyfish made of light, and she had served as a mediator for thousands of years. "In 50,000 years of galactic history," she said, her voice trembling, "no species has ever just refused. They always try to negotiate, to find compromise, to buy time." Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of conquered species stared at their communication devices in disbelief. The bug-like Zentari delegation started clicking their mandibles nervously. The plant-based Verdani began rustling their leaves, in what could only be described as excitement. Even the energy, beings of the Lux Consortium, flickered brighter than usual. But the real chaos began when the message reached the outer colonies. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, a slave laborer named Vexco was hauling ore through the tunnels when his communication implant crackled to life. The word "no" echoed through his mind, and for the first time in 30 years he stopped working. Other miners around him froze too. They had heard about the new species called humans, but nobody expected this. Vexco looked up through the tunnel opening at the stars above and felt something he had forgotten existed, the possibility that things could be different. On the agricultural colonies of Proxima, workers in the vast food production facilities heard the transmission during their mandatory rest period. A young Proximan named Kelta had been born into slavery and never imagined any other life. But when that simple word reached her ears, she stood up from her sleeping mat and walked to the window. "No," she whispered to herself, testing how the word felt in her own mouth. Around her, other workers were doing the same thing. Some were crying. Others were smiling for the first time in years. Back in the council chamber, panic was setting in. War Coordinator Zeftal's calculations showed that news of humanity's response was spreading faster than they could contain it. Conquered worlds were receiving the transmission, and something dangerous was happening. They were starting to remember what defiance looked like. Elder Korthvak's ancient voice boomed through the chamber. "Prepare the second fleet. Make it twice the size of the first. These humans clearly do not understand the consequences of their choice." But deep down, the Elder felt something he hadn't experienced in millennia: uncertainty. One small word had done what no weapon could do. It had reminded the galaxy that submission was a choice, not a law of nature. The morning after Earth's response, something incredible happened. Mountains that had looked normal for decades suddenly split open like giant doors. From deep inside these hidden bunkers, massive structures began rising toward the sky. People in small towns watched in amazement as their quiet hillsides revealed secret military bases that had been hiding underneath their feet for years. In the Swiss Alps, what locals thought was just another mountain peak opened up to reveal a launch facility bigger than most cities. Similar scenes played out across the globe, in the Rocky Mountains, the Himalayas, and even under the ocean floor. Humanity had been preparing for this day long before they knew aliens existed. Dr. Kim Yuna stood in the command center of the most secret facility on Earth, buried 3 miles under the Korean peninsula. Around her, screens showed military installations coming online worldwide. Her team had spent 20 years developing weapons and defenses that most governments didn't even know existed. "Sir," her assistant called out, "all defense grids are now active. The orbital platforms are powering up." Dr. Kim nodded as she watched massive cannons emerge from what tourists thought were just radio telescopes. These weren't the primitive weapons the aliens expected. These were magnetic accelerators that could fire projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. The fusion reactors powering them had been disguised as clean energy research for decades. She activated a secure video link to military leaders around the world. General Park Jin-hyuk from Seoul appeared on screen, followed by Admiral Chen from Beijing, Commander Volkov from Moscow, and dozens of others. These weren't just Earth's military leaders, they were the architects of humanity's greatest secret. "They're expecting us to fight like every species they've conquered before," Dr. Kim explained, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what they faced. "Rigid formations, predictable tactics, following their established rules of warfare. They've been using the same playbook for 50,000 years, General Park leaned forward. "What makes you think they haven't adapted?" "Because they've never needed to," Dr. Kim replied. "When you've conquered 10,000 worlds using the same strategy, why would you change? They expect us to line up our ships in neat rows and have a proper space battle according to their rules." Admiral Chen smiled grimly. "But humans don't follow rules when we're fighting for our lives." The screens around them showed humanity's true defensive capabilities coming online. Stealth satellites that had been disguised as space junk for years suddenly activated their weapons systems. Asteroid mining operations revealed themselves as mobile weapon platforms. Even the International Space Station opened hidden panels to show defensive turrets. Dr. Kim pulled up a holographic display showing the approaching alien fleet. 50,000 ships from 12 different species. Their commander is Fleet Admiral Morketh of the Hegemony. He's conquered over 300 worlds and never lost a single campaign. "What do we know about his tactics?" asked Commander Volkov. "Everything," Dr. Kim replied. "We've been studying their battles for months since first contact. They always start with the same pattern: overwhelming force in a direct assault, followed by orbital bombardment if there's resistance. They expect enemies to either surrender immediately or fight a conventional space battle." She changed the display to show Earth's defensive setup. "They're expecting to find a few primitive ships and maybe some missile systems. Instead, they're going to encounter defense networks that think and adapt in real time, weapons that don't behave according to known physics and tactics that will confuse every strategic computer they have." The AI systems Dr. Kim's team had developed weren't just smart, they were creative. They could learn from each enemy attack and devise new counter-strategies within seconds. The alien fleet's computers would try to predict human behavior based on their database of conquered species. But humans fought differently than anyone else in the galaxy. "Remember," Dr. Kim said as the meeting concluded, "they've spent 50,000 years learning how to defeat species that think like them. They have no idea how to fight species that think like us." As the video links closed, Dr. Kim looked out at the approaching storm. The alien fleet was still 3 months away, but she could already see their energy signatures on the long-range sensors. 50,000 ships carrying weapons that could destroy planets. But as she watched her own defenses come online, Dr. Kim felt something the aliens wouldn't expect from a primitive species. She felt ready. The galaxy was about to learn that humans had been preparing for war since the day they first looked up at the stars and wondered what else was out there. And unlike every other species the Council had conquered, humans had been preparing to win. The alien fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a storm cloud, blotting out the sun. 50,000 ships materialized at the edge of Earth's solar system, their hulls gleaming with weapons that had reduced countless worlds to ash. Fleet Admiral Morketh stood on his command bridge, confident this would be the shortest conquest in his long career. "Begin standard formation approach," he ordered his fleet commanders. "Prepare surrender demands. These humans will submit once. They see our true power." But as his sensors swept the solar system, something was wrong, very wrong. Where Morketh expected to find a few primitive satellites and maybe some crude missile platforms, his computers detected thousands of energy signatures. Weapon platforms that had been hidden among asteroids suddenly powered up. What looked like innocent space stations revealed massive cannon arrays. Even pieces of space debris began moving with purpose. "Sir," his tactical officer reported nervously, "we're detecting over 12,000 defensive positions throughout the system." How did a primitive species build so many installations? Before Morketh could answer, the human fleet appeared, but they didn't line up in the neat formations that every civilized species used for space combat. Instead, human ships scattered in all directions like leaves in a windstorm, moving in patterns that made no tactical sense. Captain Choi Hyunwoo commanded the lead human destroyer, Seoul's Defiance. His ship was smaller than most alien fighters, but it moved like it was alive. As massive enemy battleships fired their primary weapons, expecting him to either retreat or charge forward in a straight line, Choi did something unprecedented. He flew sideways. "All ships, remember your training," he broadcast to the human fleet. "Don't fight their war, fight ours." The Seoul's Defiance twisted through space in a spiraling pattern that confused every alien targeting computer. While enemy ships tried to calculate where he would be next, Choi was already somewhere else entirely, his weapons targeting the weak points that Dr. Kim's intelligence teams had identified. Human fighters swarmed through the alien formations, like angry bees, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted effectively. They ignored the traditional rules of space combat completely, diving under enemy ships, hiding in their blind spots, even using the aliens' own vessels as shields. "This is impossible," Morketh growled as he watched his tactical displays. "Where are their battle lines? Why aren't they following proper formation protocols?" His second-in-command, a veteran of 300 conquests, stared at the chaos unfolding around them. "Sir, I don't think they know there are rules." The aliens had spent 50,000 years perfecting space warfare according to established principles. Ships moved in predictable patterns, engaged at optimal ranges, and followed logical tactical doctrines. But humans threw all of that out the window. Lieutenant Park Min-seo piloted a small fighter that darted between the massive alien cruisers like a hummingbird among elephants. Her ship's AI constantly updated her targeting information, finding weak spots in alien armor that no other species had ever thought to exploit. When a massive hegemony battleship tried to swat her like a fly, she dove straight toward it instead of away, firing her weapons at point-blank range before spinning away at the last second. The battle raged for 6 days and nights. Human ships appeared and disappeared from unexpected angles. Their weapons hit targets that should have been impossible to reach. Even worse for the aliens, human tactics kept changing. Every time the alien computers thought they had figured out the human strategy, it shifted into something completely different. Admiral Morketh watched in growing horror as his fleet reports came in. Ships that had never been damaged in centuries of warfare were being destroyed by vessels a fraction of their size. His perfectly coordinated formations were falling apart as human fighters disrupted their communications and targeting systems. "How many ships have we lost?" he finally asked. 30,000, sir, over 60% of our fleet." The number hit Morketh like a physical blow. In his entire career, he had never lost more than 5% of his forces in any battle. This was supposed to be a simple show of force, not a desperate fight for survival. "Order the retreat," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of distant explosions. As the surviving alien ships fled back toward hyperspace, Captain Choi opened a communication channel to all human vessels. "This is Sol's defiance. To all ships, the enemy is withdrawing. Maintain pursuit until they leave our system." Behind them, Earth still spun peacefully in space, its blue surface unmarked by the weapons that had destroyed so many other worlds. The first species in 50,000 years had told the Galactic Council no and made it stick. But Choi knew this was just the beginning. Word of this battle would spread across the galaxy, and everything would change. The news traveled faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the alien fleet's retreat, every communication network in the galaxy buzzed with the impossible story. A primitive species called humans had defeated the mighty Galactic Council's enforcement fleet. Not just survived, actually won. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, slave laborer Vexco was hauling ore through the dark tunnels when his supervisor's communication device crackled with an emergency broadcast. The supervisor, a cruel overseer from the hegemony, went pale as he listened to the report. 30,000 council ships destroyed. The humans had said no and meant it. Vexco pretended not to hear, but inside his chest, something that had been dead for 30 years suddenly stirred back to life. Hope. Word spread through the mines like wildfire. Workers whispered to each other in the deep tunnels where the overseers couldn't hear them. "The humans won," they said. "Someone finally fought back and won." Similar scenes played out across thousands of conquered worlds. In the agricultural colonies of Proxima, workers, who had spent their entire lives bent over in the fields, stood up straight for the first time in years. On the factory planets of the Outer Rim, slaves who had forgotten their own names began remembering what freedom felt like. Ambassador Won Silgi sat in her office on Earth, staring at communication screens that hadn't stopped flashing for 3 days. Her small diplomatic team was overwhelmed by the flood of incoming messages. These weren't official transmissions from governments. They were secret communications from enslaved peoples across the galaxy. "Ambassador," her assistant called out, "we're receiving another coded transmission from the Andromedans. They're offering to share intelligence about Council fleet movements." Wansulgi nodded, still amazed by what was happening. "What about the Centaurians? They want to send us detailed maps of Council supply routes, and the Vegan resistance is asking if we need raw materials for ship construction." The messages kept coming. Species that had been conquered centuries ago were suddenly reaching out to Earth, offering whatever help they could provide. Some sent technical data about alien weapons. Others provided star charts showing Council military bases. A few, even, offered to sabotage Council installations from within. But the most important messages were the simplest ones. Beings from across the galaxy were sending the same word that humanity had broadcast. No. They were saying it in their own languages, in their own ways, but the meaning was universal. Back in the Council chambers, panic was setting in. Young Councillor Bractul of the Hegemony stood before the assembled elders, his normally confident voice shaking with worry. "The situation is worse than we initially calculated," he reported. "Our defeat at Earth wasn't just a military loss. It was a symbol. These humans have done something no species has accomplished in 50,000 years. They've made rebellion seem possible again." Elder Korthvak's ancient voice creaked with anger. "How bad is the unrest?" 17 worlds have stopped sending tribute shipments. 43 others are reporting production delays that are clearly deliberate. We're receiving reports of sabotage, work slowdowns, and what can only be described as organized resistance movements. The elders' metallic forms seem to dim with worry. And the humans? They're not just sitting quietly after their victory. Our intelligence suggests they're actively communicating with resistance groups throughout our territory. They're sharing tactical information, providing encouragement, and worst of all, they're teaching others to say no. In the shadows of the Council chamber, representatives from conquered species sat quietly, but many of them were secretly recording everything. Those recordings would find their way to resistance networks, spreading the news that even the mighty Council was afraid. On Earth, Wan Seulgi worked around the clock to coordinate with the growing network of rebel contacts. Her team had grown from 5 diplomats to over 100 specialists, managing communications with dozens of species. "Ambassador," her communications officer reported, "we're getting a message from a species called the Keplerians. They're asking for our help in liberating their homeworld." Wan Seulgi felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Humanity had started something that was bigger than just Earth now. By refusing to submit, they had reminded the galaxy that submission was a choice, not a law of nature. "Send them our standard response," she said. "We stand with all free peoples, and we will help however we can." Outside her window, Wan Seulgi could see human ships preparing for their next mission. They weren't just defending Earth anymore. They were becoming something the galaxy hadn't seen in millennia. They were becoming liberators. And across the galaxy, on thousands of worlds where beings had forgotten what freedom looked like, people were learning a new word in a human language, a simple word that was changing everything. No. Admiral Kang Miho stood in the command center, looking at star charts that showed something unprecedented in galactic history. Red dots marked Council-controlled systems, but now blue dots were appearing, worlds that had declared independence after hearing about humanity's victory. The galaxy was changing, and she intended to help it change faster. "We're not waiting for them to regroup and attack us again," she announced to her assembled fleet commanders. "Every day we sit here, more innocent people suffer under Council rule. It's time to take the fight to them." The Liberation Fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human ships flew alongside vessels from species that had broken free from Council control. Andromedan cruisers worked with Earth destroyers, vegan fighters trained with human pilots. Former enemies now fought side by side against their common oppressor. Captain Nam Dong-min commanded the lead task force assigned to liberate the vegan mining colonies. His ship, the Busan Liberation, was joined by 12 other vessels, a mix of human technology and alien designs that had been upgraded with Earth's adaptive AI systems. "Remember," he broadcast to his fleet as they approached the target system, "we're not here to conquer, we're here to free. Once we've dealt with the Council forces, we leave. The Vegans get to decide their own future." This was a completely alien concept to most of the galaxy. For 50,000 years, warfare meant conquest. Winners took everything from losers, their resources, their people, their freedom. But humans fought for something different. The vegan system was heavily fortified. Massive orbital platforms surrounded the mining worlds, bristling with weapons designed to keep the enslaved population from escaping. Council warships patrolled the space lanes, ensuring that tribute shipments flowed smoothly to the core worlds. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "we're detecting 47 Council vessels and 16 orbital defense platforms. They're powering up weapons and moving to intercept." Nam Dongmin smiled grimly. "They still think we're going to fight like everyone else. All ships initiate Liberation Protocol 7. The human fleet scattered in their now famous chaotic pattern, but this time they had help. Andromedan ships, with their natural cloaking abilities, vanished from sensors entirely. Vegan rebels who had escaped years earlier guided the attacking forces through hidden asteroid fields that provided perfect cover. The battle was swift and decisive. Human ships danced through enemy fire, while their alien allies struck from unexpected angles. The Council forces, still trying to adapt to humanity's unconventional tactics, found themselves completely outmaneuvered. But the real shock came after the fighting ended. Instead of landing troops to occupy the mining colonies, the Liberation fleet simply destroyed the orbital control stations and left. They didn't claim the Vegan worlds for Earth. They didn't demand tribute or resources. They just left the Vegans free to govern themselves. On the surface of Vega Prime, millions of former slaves walked out of the mines for the first time in generations. They looked up at the sky, watching the human ships disappear into hyperspace, and many of them cried. Not from sadness, but from joy they had forgotten was possible. News of the liberation spread even faster than the victory at Earth had. Council intelligence networks buzzed with reports that made no sense to their analysts. The humans had won a complete military victory and then left without taking anything. Young Councillor Bracktool delivered another worried report to the Council elders. They're not following any recognizable pattern of conquest. They attack for installations, free the local populations, and then withdraw. They're not building an empire. They're destroying ours. Similar liberation missions followed across the galaxy. Captain Lee Soo-young freed the Centaurian agricultural worlds. Commander Park Ji-hoon liberated the Andromedan research stations. Each time the pattern was the same: swift victory followed by immediate withdrawal, leaving freed peoples to determine their own destinies. The philosophy spread like wildfire. Resistance groups on Council worlds began adopting human tactics, not just militarily but philosophically. They fought not to replace one ruler with another, but to eliminate rulers entirely. On Earth, Admiral Kang watched the spreading liberation with satisfaction. "We're not building an empire," she told her staff. "We're teaching the galaxy that empires aren't necessary." Her communications officer looked up from his displays. "Admiral, we're receiving requests for liberation assistance from over 200 star systems. How do we prioritize?" Kang smiled. "We don't. We train them to liberate themselves." The galaxy was learning a new way of thinking. For the first time in 50 millennia, beings across the stars were discovering that freedom wasn't something granted by rulers. It was something you took for yourself. And at the center of it all was humanity's simple message. Everyone had the right to say no. The ancient world of Omnispex Prime had been the center of galactic power for 50,000 years. Its massive cities stretched across entire continents, built from the tribute of 10,000 conquered worlds. Golden spires reached toward the stars, each one a monument to the Council's absolute authority. But today those spires trembled as the greatest fleet in galactic history gathered in orbit above them. Elder Korthvak stood in the Council's war room, watching displays that showed over 100,000 ships surrounding his homeworld. Every vessel that remained loyal to the Council had been called home for this final battle. Warships from dozens of species filled the space around Omnispex Prime like a steel wall. "They will come," he told his fellow Council members. "The humans and their rebel allies cannot resist such a target. When they attack this fortress, we will crush them once and for all." But War Coordinator Zeftal was studying the sensor readings with growing unease. "Elder, the approaching fleet, it's not what we expected." The human fleet that emerged from hyperspace was impressive, but it wasn't the massive armada the Council had prepared to face. Commander Zhang Yunwu led perhaps 20,000 ships, a significant force but nowhere near enough to challenge the Council's defenses. What made the Elder's blood run cold was who else had come with them. "Sir," Zeftal reported, his mechanical voice shaking. "We're detecting ships from the Andromedan Republic, the Free Vegan Alliance, the liberated Centaurian worlds, and dozens of other independent systems. The approaching fleet wasn't just humans and their rebel allies. It was every species that had broken free from council control, flying together as equals. Former slaves now fought alongside their liberators, not as servants but as partners. Commander Zhang opened a communication channel that reached every ship in both fleets. His voice was calm and steady as he spoke. "We're not here to conquer Omnispecs Prime. We're here to offer everyone a choice, the same choice humanity made when we said no to tyranny. On the council ships, crews who had served the hegemony for generations listened to his words with growing amazement. They had been told that humans were savage primitives who threatened galactic peace. But the young human commander spoke about freedom, dignity, and the right of all beings to choose their own destiny. The battle began not with massive weapons fire, but with something more powerful: defection. A squadron of hegemony destroyers suddenly broke formation and flew toward the human fleet. Their commander broadcast a simple message: "We choose freedom." Elder Korthvac watched in horror as his carefully assembled defense began falling apart. Ship after ship was abandoning their positions, crossing over to join the growing coalition of free worlds. These weren't tactical retreats or strategic withdrawals. These were conscious choices by beings who had decided they didn't want to serve an empire anymore. "Stop them," he ordered. "Fire on the defectors." But War Coordinator Zeftal hesitated. "Sir, many of the departing ships contain our own people, hegemony citizens who are choosing to leave." The philosophical battle that Commander Zhang had mentioned was happening before their eyes. This wasn't about superior weapons or brilliant tactics. It was about ideas, and the idea of freedom was proving more powerful than any fleet. Captain Kim Ji-won, flying a small human corvette, found herself surrounded by alien vessels that had switched sides mid-battle. A massive Vorthak cruiser, the same species that had first demanded Earth's submission, flew alongside her tiny ship as an equal partner. "Human vessel," the Vorthak captain transmitted. "We apologize for our species' past actions. We wish to learn this concept you call democracy." Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Entire fleets that had served the Council for centuries were choosing freedom over security, uncertainty over oppression. The galaxy's enslaved peoples had found their voice, and it echoed humanity's simple message: no. Elder Korthvac realized with growing panic that he was losing more ships to defection than to enemy fire. His perfect defensive formation was collapsing not because it was defeated, but because his own forces no longer believed in what they were fighting for. "This is impossible," he whispered. "We've maintained order for 50,000 years." Young Councillor Braktul, who had been watching the defections with quiet satisfaction, finally spoke up. "Perhaps that was the problem, Elder. Order without choice isn't really order at all, it's just fear with better organization." As more Council ships joined the coalition, Commander Zhang realized that humanity had accomplished something unprecedented. They hadn't just won a military victory, they had won something far more important. They had reminded the galaxy what freedom looked like. The surrender of the Galactic Council didn't happen with signing ceremonies or formal documents. It happened quietly, one world at a time, as entire civilizations simply stopped obeying orders that no longer made sense to them. Elder Korthvac sat alone in his vast chamber on Omnispecs Prime, staring at communication screens that had gone silent. For 3 days he had been sending commands across the galaxy, orders for tribute collections, demands for military reinforcements, instructions for maintaining order, but nobody was responding anymore. His assistant, a nervous creature from a species that had served the Council for 2,000 years, delivered the final report with trembling hands. "Sir, the last loyal fleet has just declared independence. We no longer control any territory outside this solar system." The Elder's ancient form slumped in defeat. 50,000 years of galactic dominance had ended not with a massive battle, but with countless beings across the stars making the same simple choice that humans had made. No. On Earth, Representative Seo Hanul found herself in the strangest position in human history. Delegations from thousands of worlds were arriving daily, all asking the same question. Now what? For the first time in galactic memory, nobody was in charge of everything, and everyone was free to choose their own path. "We need to build something new," she told the assembled representatives in what had once been the United Nations building, but was now hosting the galaxy's first truly voluntary gathering. Not another empire, not another council of rulers, but something that's never existed before, a partnership of equals. The idea was revolutionary. Every species would have a voice, but no species would have control over others. Decisions would be made through cooperation, not domination. Trade would be voluntary, not forced tribute. Military protection would be mutual defense, not conquest and occupation. A delegation of former hegemony officials struggled to understand these concepts. "But who will maintain order?" asked their leader, a being who had spent his entire life following and giving commands. "We all will," Seo Hanul replied with a smile. Together, the process wasn't easy. Species that had been enslaved for centuries had to learn how to make decisions for themselves. Former council members had to accept that they were no longer superior to anyone else. But gradually, the new Galactic Confederation took shape. Messy, chaotic, sometimes inefficient, but absolutely free. Dr. Kim Yuna, now serving as Earth's Minister of Interstellar Relations, often found herself explaining human concepts to beings who had never heard such ideas before. "What is this voting process?" asked a Centaurian delegate. "How can everyone's opinion matter equally?" "That's what we call democracy," Dr. Kim explained patiently. "It means that power comes from the people, not from rulers who claim they know better." The transformation spread across the galaxy like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Former mining worlds became independent republics. Agricultural colonies formed cooperative federations. Even the great industrial centers learned to operate without slave labor, discovering that free workers were far more productive and innovative than forced ones. But perhaps the most important change was philosophical. Children across the galaxy grew up learning that they had choices, that they could say no to things they didn't want, and that freedom was not a privilege granted by rulers, but a right that belonged to everyone. Ambassador Won Sulgi, now elderly, but still serving as Earth's senior diplomat, often received visitors from young civilizations who wanted to hear the story directly from someone who had been there. They always asked the same question: "How did you know that one word would change everything?" "We didn't," she would answer honestly. "We just knew we couldn't say yes to slavery. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is the simplest thing. Refuse to accept what's wrong." The story became legend across the galaxy. Parents told their children about the small blue world that had faced the mightiest empire in history and responded with a single word. Students studied the Battle of Earth in their history classes. Poets wrote songs about the day freedom returned to the stars. Earth never became the galaxy's ruler. Humans never demanded tribute or built an empire. Instead, they became something far more powerful. They became the species that reminded everyone else what freedom meant. And in 1,000 languages across 1,000,000 worlds, beings who had never met a human learned to say the word that had changed everything: no. It was a simple word, but it carried the power to transform civilizations. It reminded the galaxy that some things could never be taken away as long as someone was brave enough to refuse to give them up. The age of empires was over. The age of freedom had begun.